So the organization structure of standards making body, actually, Professor Bandu gave me that title, so that's, but I kind of inserted IEEE SA, which is, does anybody know what IEEE stands for?
Probably not.
So I'm asking,
We do.
yep,
Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers.
you get extra
Oh,
points.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Actually, at the
You
end,
must say a lot more so that the others also get what this is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll move on. So I also have here Catherine Bennett. She's actually works for the IEEE SA staff. I'm a member of IEEE, just like if you are, and students can be members of IEEE as well. So, but we
Actually,
work
the
very
students,
closely.
The graduate students in the IEEE graduate, whatever chapter, have a conference actually this Friday here. It's a research R&D conference.
Oh, yeah?
They are very active, yes.
Yeah, and I became an IEEE member when I was a student, and I've maintained that, and you know how old I am, because it is, I feel, is important. You learn a lot, so I would encourage you to be part of IEEE. As a student, the fees are very low, so take advantage of it.
And many are
yeah.
biomedical engineers, so they can become part student member of the Engineering and Medicine Biology Society, a society that I ran for a while. And the key thing about this is that most of the standards that are related to healthcare, biomedical standards, is by IEEE EMBS societies members. And the other thing is that IEEE is the world's largest professional organization, the largest in the world. There's
Right.
nothing like that.
Well, I'll have some of those
Oh, you
points.
do have that?
So, yeah, some of those points here, and appreciate that. So our key points today for this evening, there's three parts that I'm going to work on. I'm going to provide an overview of the standards organization, only from geographic designation, so that you can at least, I know it's confusing, ISO, IEC, AAMI, ANSI, ASTM, IEEE, that kind of thing. But don't get bogged down on these things, but I'll just kind of give you an idea of where these things fall. Also based on on their role, it might change in their category. And then we're going to talk about mostly on the introducing the IEEE SA structure. SA stands for Standards Association, and in the IEEE Standards Development process. And then after that, Catherine will show you how to get involved, even as students. There's ways, tools, and resources available. We also have a Standards University, and she's also going to talk about there's grants on that as well. What happened? Why did it change? You have a fancy computer. I just have a simple Mac, so.
I don't really understand that computer, what she's thinking.
All right, so standards organization, you'll hear probably this word, standards body, standards developing organization, standards setting body, organizations, all that kinds of, but to me, in my mind, they have different roles, but they are organizations, they're a body. Just remember that standards organization, their responsibility is to kind of develop standards, maintain standards, promulgate rules and things like that. So in essence, that's all you need to know. No, why is, okay. I don't know how to use your computer. How do you go back? How do you go back? Yeah. Okay. Up and down? Okay. All right, so, that's where we're at? All right, so national standards body. So generally, a country has a single recognized national standard organization. And in the US, it's called ANSI. You've heard of the word ANSI, you've seen that on standards like ANSI 80 or ANSI ISO or ANSI something, or just ANSI. And in the UK, it's the British Standards Institute. Canada has Standards Council of Canada. Japan is Japan Industrial Standards Committee. In Germany, I won't say what it means, it's BIN, because I can't pronounce it. And this standards body are members of ISO. And they're sort of the body that goes to ISO and present the standards that have been developed within the country. They don't normally develop the technical content of the standards. It is the societies, for instance, in IEEE, the technical societies, that develop the standards. So they're composed of private and public members. Do this wrong. All right. So what is the role of ANSI then? What's they play? They're the voice of the U.S. standards as well as conformity assessment. And they oversee the development of voluntary consent standards. They also, sorry about that, I'm just kind of like not used
Do
to.
you want me to?
This is not centered anywhere. So they enhance global competitiveness of U.S. businesses in the global economy and also help assure safety and health of consumers and protect the environment. They're also the body that accredits standards development organizations within the U.S. So there's a set of rules or requirements or best practices that standards development organization must meet and then they are ANSI accredited. IEEE is ANSI accredited, as well as ASTM, I believe. Yeah. And then this one?
No, this.
This one? Just this thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are also what we call regional standards organization. Regional standards organization, you've heard earlier about the European, in the EU. In the EU, they only standards created by CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI are recognized in EU. That's from the regional standards, regional area. So they're in the Americas, they have the Pan American Standards Commission, and in Asia Pacific, you have the Consultative Committee for Standards and Quality. What I do, for me, I mean, it's good to know that these things are around, but I focus on really the direction of where I want to be in that regard. So now, learn this thing one at a time. But once you've seen it, at least it gives you an idea. CEN, CENELEC, ETSI, they're EU. So there are regional standards organization. International Standards Organization, we've talked about. Three of the most well-established and largest organization is ISO, stands for International Organization Standardization, which was established in 1947. And then the International Electrotechnical Commission in 1906. The ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, is oldest in 1865. So for medical, my background is medical device regulations, right? And that's what I review. So I work with, we worked with ISO and IEC standards a lot in that regard. So there are also organizations that are independent. For example, the ASME, ASTM, CISPR, GS1, and the IEEE SA. Some of these, is that me? What is that?
I don't know. Really don't know.
There's a ghost in this room.
She's in a good mood, I think.
Is that your computer? But, so like I said before, like ANSI is sort of like the conduit from US standards to the international standards. But in some cases, like IEEE have direct relationship or liaison to ISO and IEC. So in fact, we do have agreements with them as well. So kind of confusing, but it's really not after you kind of sort it all out. And the only way really is to get involved, because I've been being involved with standards development since I started with FDA in the 90s, and I'm still learning something every day.
So Carol, why, so there's so many, like you said, many standard organizations. Why do you choose to involve in IEEE, not other?
Oh, a good question. So when I was with the FDA, I was involved with the national standards, AAMI. So there's a lot of the medical device standards were created under AAMI. And then AAMI is the American Association for Medical Instrumentation. That's why I can't say it. It's the same thing with IEEE. So we were working with ISO and IEC because of this international standards, like for example, I work in cardiovascular devices, so implantable, active implantables. So those are really the bigger companies and everything, and we would be participating in the standards development. With IEEE, I was a volunteer, like an outside activity. For government, there's ethics involved, so I cannot really get involved with IEEE, except as sort of like an observer, and I wanted to learn their system. That was my own personal interest, and that's how I got involved with the IEEE, because I was an IEEE member. You see what I mean? I told you since I was a student. What I find is that after I kind of left FDA, and I'm getting more involved with standards now, so we're producing a lot more standards. But what I find is that with IEEE, it's open to everyone, and whether you're an IEEE member or not. And also, the smaller companies can be players. Because in this other standards developing organization that I was involved with, again, I'm speaking from my experience, only the big players are there because it requires money, time, and and the small companies are sort of like intimidated by the big companies. Because when I don't know what your when you go to ASTM, but with the meetings with ISO and IEC, you've been in those meetings too. There's a lot of fighting involved. Although after that, we all drink together at night and have dinner. You know what I mean?
That's true.
Yeah. So, but that's the culture of it in that regard. And I mean, I don't see small players playing because it
Yeah.
requires travel as well.
Yeah.
So that's the one reason is because, like I said, the smaller other stakeholders can easily join in the standards development process at the level that you would like to get involved. And as long as you have interest in standards, it's open. But we can go through that a little bit more. But that's the reason.
So does the FDA have a preference whether IEEE or ASTM or ISO in recognizing standards?
No, the FDA has no preference as long as it's a voluntary consensus standards based on the principles of standardization.
Actually,
And
maybe
all-
the students must understand this because I only recently understood when Bill Ash educated us about the neurotechnology standards activity that we are involved in. In US, the standards are voluntary, and companies that may answer you also. And a lot of the processes are from bottom up, grassroots up, most of them. In the world, globally, like in China, you had the first lecture from this man from ASTM China, how he explained from top down. And it's mandatory most of the stuff, especially the standard. So it's really very different. But these groups are operating all over the world with what I think Sharon was saying, with a lot of authority because they are able to bring all the stakeholders, not necessarily the big players, but they have a lot of credibility if credibility brings respect and sort of acceptance.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe Connors on your group, they will be explained later, is really not just they have credibility, also participants feel by participating in this, they gain certain social, cultural capitals, like they maintain their reputation, visibility in the industry, in the field.
In the community and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is that most of these bodies that are grassroots, as you assemble it in IEEE and stuff, they are representative of the community, or you try to make it representative of the community. In other countries, it's not like that.
Uniquely American. I don't think Europe is like
Yeah,
this.
it's American.
It's a uniquely American. It's very good.
It's
number
very
one.
American,
It's
very good
uniquely
thing.
American that
Yeah.
is the grassroots comes up and forms this and has and gains power and authority due to the fact that
They get
a lot of
involved,
stakeholders are involved. Like GE comes, Philips comes, consumer advocacy comes to, then on the government FDA comes with it, but FDA cannot force them. FDA calls most of it, as you know, by the guidance. It's not mandatory, it says the guidance. It's It's a good way of doing it, but if you argue, I did it differently and I'm achieving the same thing, it's okay.
But
Yes.
I wonder
So
if,
the one reason why it's voluntary is because we believe that standards are evolving, there's living documents. So if you make it mandatory, it's like, and things have already changed, and then you're telling the company
But
to
my
still
question
follow
is-
the same old standard, it does not apply to their device, then it's.
But is it the same in
Yeah.
Europe? Is
Clari-
in Europe
Yeah,
coming from top down?
so this notion of voluntary consensus actually tie back to what we mentioned, this whole globalization. The whole world in 1990 embraced this so deregulation, free trade, free trading zone. So standard, in the past, it was used as a kind of rule, mandatory rule to discipline, to regulate. After 1999, there's a fundamental meaning change of standard is, to promote innovation. That's why in today's article, we will read this WTO TBT, the organizing WTO try to lower down this trade barrier, and they really have put a lot of emphasis on what's the kind of international standard WTO recognized is very importantly, you should not create what? Create what? The standard WTO recognized should not increase trade barrier. Right? So the whole notion of a standardization, kind of gradually moved. And it's not just in the US, it's in the whole world once we start to embrace globalization. And the meaning of standard shift from mandatory coercive rule into this voluntary embrace, self-governance, soft governance. So
is it mandatory in US? No.
certain, there's
There were,
certain,
yeah,
a little.
some safety stuff.
Right. But most of it's because we have this public act, NTTA, and also OMB 19, that actually this kind of get back to authority. Our political system provides that infrastructure for voluntary standard maker to claim the authority to govern, and that's the system here. And so if we want to understand the EU or China, how their standardization system, we really need to understand their kind of political system. What grants them, what kind of political infrastructure grants these standard maker in China or in Europe the power to govern? And in China, but as Banu mentioned, their political system is more like Beijing central government, kind of make the big direction. But Liu Fei, if you still remember, he said, Chinese people are really good at reading each other's mind, interpreting their local action into this, to fit in this big direction. So I would say top down, bottom up is not a precise, accurate term to describe this very complicated situation of standardization in different countries. But one thing we can be sure that because of this globalization trend, more and more countries, even China, are embracing free trading. They are creating, Asian Investment Bank, all this infrastructure for different countries to be able to move their technology across the border, right? And standard is a very, very important tool to lower down the social, cultural, economic, political barriers, right? So back to the question whether European is centralized, it's definitely different. Even UK and Germany are different, even they belong to the big EU because their political system are different. But I would say in a kind of bigger, the whole world is embracing globalization. So voluntary consensus making become a global trend. The tricky thing is different organizations define consensus in a different way. And that's where all these different politics play in. 2/3 or 1/2, who can vote, this and that. So that kind of, these kind of devils in detail. It is really, how, whether it's top down or bottom up, it's not a black and white. It's more like every organization, depending on its policy, depending on who run the organization, has its organization policy to recruiting certain members, excluding certain members, and also making sure the voting policies in order to reach so-called consensus.
Is there something like IEEE in China?
They have an office in IEEE China,
So
as
that-
well as Japan.
Not that IEEE has offices everywhere.
Not everywhere.
Well,
China-
almost I know I'm
China,
from Iran.
India,
I know
Japan.
IEEE has an office in Iran. Right, and in Middle
I
East.
don't know.
So, yeah, they do. Now, but it's drawn basically from IEEE in the US. To a
Yes,
large
exactly,
degree.
exactly.
They get their authority from here.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is the homegrown voluntary organization within these countries. You see, there's a difference. There's an IEEE who has a branch in every Middle Eastern country.
But even IEEE, the standards that they produce are voluntarily, it's voluntary, it's
But I
not.
think the question Banu asked touches a different fundamental issue. The role of voluntary group, that they gain power and authority because they got together, that is different than if I, as the president or king of the country, I assign a minister of regulation. There is a fundamental difference, and I guess there's somewhere in between.
Just my final word as this example. ISO got a lot of power. Very important reason is they partnership with WTO. And in WTO, they have TBT, which kind of accepts or recognize, a lot of countries actually recognizing ISO standard as an international standards. And so what I'm trying to say is China has its standard, of course, and it's probably more top-down than US. But each country also needs there's a translational process. Each country needs to go, when they trade, and they need to justify in front of WTO that, even I'm using my national standard, but my national standard does not create a trade barrier, and my national standard actually is adopted or translated, or there's some kind of a relationship between my national standard and international standards. So this is whole chain in the standardization world that made the ISO extremely powerful, not by itself, but by connecting that ISO to many, many different countries or transnational bodies.
I want to add to that, just to clarify. So we already said the FDA does not mandate, it's voluntary standards. So even if they recognize, you would go through this process, it's FDA recognized standards because it carries more weight. But on the other hand, they don't have to use those standards. They can actually even use standards of their own company if there are no standards available, this is why we need standards as well. It's consensus standards. Now in Europe, as I mentioned before, the SEN, Senelec, and ETSI developed from those standards are the ones that they accept. However, what happens is that when we have ISO, IEC, and meetings, they also participate because there are two documents. One is the international standard, the ISO, and one is the Senelec standard, which is actually pretty much the same. But because their law says it has to be a European SEN, Senelec, or ETSI, they have to do that. In Japan, it's mandatory. Use of standards is mandatory, and the way it goes is that they have to be recognized. They don't actually develop standards, but they participate in standards development. And then they want to see the ISO branding. And once it becomes an ISO or IEC international standard, they change it into what they call GIS, Japanese International Standard. So there's some differences in that. The reason I know Japan is because I was a Mansfield Fellow in Japan and worked with the MHLW, the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, and so we dealt with that. The European would be something that I had, from my experience. The other countries, I don't really know how they do it, like you said, China or others, but I think, so for me, it's like we need to think locally, but act globally in that regard. Do you see what I mean? Because we have national deviations as well. When we recognize some of the standards that FDA says, we would have some deviations because of our national requirements. but then overall, we have to think globally when we are producing standards. Does that help a little,
Yeah.
some differences?
Oh, so if you're confused, don't worry. We will have our group 5, 6, right? Who is going to teach the detail about WTO, TPTs, and standardization after Kara's presentation.
Well, okay, so IEEE is like, as Professor Onoral mentioned, it's the world's largest technical professional organization for advancing technology for humanity. That is kind of their, what do you call those, what do you call the term when you have?
Slogan.
Slogan.
Motto.
There's over 420,000 members and growing, I think, in over 160 countries. IEEE produces conferences, organized conferences, and that's how we actually, 2 years ago, when Professor Onoral came to EMBS flagship conference, and we started that first panel, the standards panel.
Was it the first panel?
It's the first, because
That's when I
I
was
said it's
hooked.
very challenging to be in standards. I mean, is that me?
Continue.
Anyway, so because I've been like working with the EMBS Society as the standards committee chair, and it's not going anywhere. So first of all, IEEE has not been very well known on developing device standards. But like I said, I wanted to be in IEEE because I know that I like their paradigm, and so mostly academics, professors. Nobody from industry, or maybe one or two, they don't listen, no matter what we do. But I had one professor from Hong Kong, Chinese University of Hong Kong, a professor, academic, who came to me. I was still at FDA, says, I want to develop the standards on wearable cuffless blood pressure monitor. There was no such thing at that time. And traditionally,
white design.
right, white design. And typically, standards are being developed traditionally. It's like, okay, let's make all the blood pressures here, all the companies, different blood pressures. Then let's get together and do a standard. That's how it's been normally done, right? So his paradigm was kind of different. We know this is emerging, it's coming, like, what we're talking about today, it's a future kind of thing. So let's develop some sort of standard requirements, just to, for testing or something. And so I really like that idea. It took a long time to do that, only because people did not, it was a good standard. It was typically, in IEEE, it's 4 years that they give you to complete a standard. It took us 8 years, because the first time it went around, we didn't have a balance of voting. And so that got it thrown back in, and we expanded pool. So those are like lessons learned in that regard. So I was hoping we would get that standard before the first manufacturer of wearable cuffless blood pressure monitor came out to market and approved by FDA. We were 2 years late. But, and this is kind of like lessons learned, and some of the challenges and standards, but I don't give up. We continued. Almost, Whitey didn't want to do it anymore. I said, no, we got to do this. This is a good thing to do. And so I think now the trend, like today you were talking about, we need to, get involved.
I have to confess now, because I was the president of EMBS, and YT was my conference VP and stuff like this, and because I ignored standards and did not truly put the effort that I should have put, of course the poor YT, though he wanted to do these things, he was put into other things.
Yeah.
So that's why it took. But I'm happy that he stayed on and demonstrated that that's how we should be working with emergency. So I'm going to send him a thank you note, right?
Oh, please.
Can I
withstand me.
Can I ask a question? So far, after you hear all this backstage story about standard, who actually would be interested in participating in standard making? Raise your hand, be honest.
Yay.
Oh, we got 2,
Oh my gosh.
3.
I see
And you
4.
have a guest who wants to participate,
Yeah.
an IoT guest. Yeah.
I already got him before even he came to us.
Okay.
Why? Give me some reason why those raising your hand.
We'll just be able to decide the direction that a field's going to be going.
And why do you want to take that leadership role? For what? For who?
Just so you have comfort that it's going to be done right, I guess.
hey, he's here to change the world,
Yeah.
make it better.
RFID, which helps you to read and access ID from a distance. I was talking about like 10 to 15 feet without any of line of sight. So it gives a great capability to be able to do the inventory of the assets in hospitals dramatically faster.
What do you mean by asset? Because they may not know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
What do
the
you mean
assets,
by
the most critical assets in the hospitals are biomedical assets.
devices,
Yes.
instruments?
The expensive standards.
So you sell the paper, basically, not the stuff that's.
So the smaller ones, not so much.
No electronic paper.
So do you know standard actually, you
Electron.
need to pay to buy standard? Do you know that?
Yeah.
At this university, they can have access. It's how do we, how
Not all,
does J2?
not all of them.
Yeah, we only-
Depends
No?
on, it depends if you need a particular standard, for example, you go to JBAC and you buy it.
The
and-
librarian that they
And they are
know.
very expensive, so this is, for example, for my class, we don't have all the standards that the students need to do. It's very expensive, some of them are, typically that the 1,000 page, how much is, do you know the price?
I think, I'm not really sure.
Roughly.
I think I heard one time 400 or 500, something like that, 600.
You know, and it depends on when it goes out to market. So for 802, for example, when it first goes out, for the first 6 months, it's in the market. It's offered to them in the market at a premium cost. So let's say $400 for a large standard. After 6 months, it goes into what we call the Get 802 program, and then it's free to the world to download.
Yeah,
Because
you should know that.
Oh,
Get
that's
free.
what Jay
802.
should know.
802 has subsidized that to be able to happen.
Yeah, that's very good. Are you familiar with Jay Beth, who's our engineering librarian?
No.
Yeah, it would be good if
Well, this one.
I
We have
introduced
to
the
connect
teachers.
with
Yeah,
each
yeah,
other.
because many of our students are